We are indebted to God for his love for us. And we're here this morning because of his mercy. It was one apostle that says, I must decrease so that God can have the increase. It was 4:31 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on Monday, January 17th, 1999, when suddenly, without warning, a moderate but very damaging earthquake with a magnitude of 6.7 struck the population of San Fernando Valley in northern Los Angeles. The death toll was 57, and more than 1,500 people were seriously injured. A few days after the earthquake, 9,000 homes and businesses were still without electricity. 20,000 without gas, and more than 48,000 had little to no water. About 12,000 structures were damaged, leaving thousands temporarily homeless. Earthquakes are geographical phenomena that cannot be predicted, controlled, or stopped. However, there is another kind of earthquake that can be predicted, and mostly it can be prevented. I'm talking about a moral earthquake. Like natural earthquakes, moral earthquakes can happen along fault lines. Fault lines are proclivities and propensities within the heart that, given the right stimulus and the right condition, can cause an eruption for moral failure. Faults are defined as defects or imperfections. Needless to say, what defines us is not our faults, but how we bounce back. In life, many of us are going to have many fault lines in our lives that are going to create destructive contexts in our lives. Many of us, as we know at this moment, are wrestling with ideas of how can I better myself and get out of the fault lines. But I'm reminded that Christ can heal fault lines. How can I attain and master who Jesus is in my life? Because that is the super glue. That is the common denominator that brings us back from the fault lines of destructions. We come to a place in Matthew where Jesus is giving us a new method of mastering ourselves and who we are. It is not by might, it is not by knowledge, but Jesus is challenging us with a new practice to prevent the fault lines in our lives. And so we come to this context in the Bible that Jesus is now given the Beatitudes. And one of the first things that he does is that he walks out of the synagogue and he goes up to an elevated place. And there the people follow him to an elevated place. And I've learned that in order for God to elevate you, he's got to separate you from some stuff. There are some stuff that's causing the fault lines in our lives that Jesus is now starting to get us to re-socialize ourselves to some new principles that'll help us prevent it. In chapter 21 in Matthew, one of my favorite passages, Jesus walks into the synagogue and he sees the leaders of the society misusing and misrepresenting the temple. And there he's turning over tables in the sanctuary. He's turning over the tables of hypocrisy of their actions. The turning over tables symbolizes that he was turning over everything that they held sacred. And I've come to understand that when you walk into the proximity of God, he then exposes you to yourself, and now you recognize how far of a distance I am for God. And there are some things that I have to remove myself from. And it's tough to look in the mirror and recognize that I'm broken. It's tough to look in the mirror and recognize that even when I tried my very best, it still doesn't measure up. But God is saying, look here, I want to give you just a new set of principles to help you live by. Because I know that you're in college, and I know that the American dream is to go to college and get this big degree, and you can work in this fancy company. And now you got your 401k. You got all that stuff. But God said, look here, I'm not here for that. Because when I come back to earth, I'm going to be looking for faith. So therefore, I just want to give you just a few things before you get over yourself. What are those things? But before I give you those things, the Jews of this time thought that money, power, prestige, and pleasure was the highest form of spirituality. In other words, it was the biggest house, it was the finest car, it was having all the creature comforts. But the one thing they forgot was about the poor. They forgot about the downtrodden. They forgot about the sick, the grieving, and the meek, and the lowly. The people that when we drive past are living under the underpasses. Those people who are in mental health asylums. Those who are dealing with opioid addiction, the prostitutes, the drug dealers. All of those who are living outside the outskirts of the city and don't have adequate resources. Jesus is saying, this is what I want you to do, and this is the type of attitude that I want you to have while you're going to see him. If you're one of the poor, the Jews saw that God was punishing you for something, and that you've done in your life. And that's how many of us view God. We view God as a disciplinarian who punishes us because deep in our hearts, we don't believe that God loves us. So we come to the text. We come to Matthew chapter 5, and Jesus gives us a new method. This new method, this first method that Jesus is elevating himself to a high place, and he removes himself from the toxicity of society. Now, Jesus moved in geographical location, but the location that he will have us to move is the spiritual location. In order for God to elevate you, he first must separate you. Jesus started to preach, and he starts off by saying, blessed. Blessed. Blessed is not based upon a happening, neither is it a sign of wealth, but Jesus explains to them that blessed is a state of being. That it goes beyond your social class. It goes beyond the money that you got. It goes beyond your last name. It goes beyond the college that you attend. But blessed is something from everybody, and God is not prejudiced about us being blessed. And so he says, blessed are those. Blessed is a position that affirms that you are in God's presence. Blessed is the thing that really crystallizes the fact that we are following God. And so he says, look here, I don't care if you're sitting on the front row or the last row. Blessed are those. Now he separates himself from everything else. He said, look, I'm going to call you out. And that's what holy and sanctified means, to be called out. And I've stopped by here to tell you this morning that here at Abilene Christian, you've been called out. But not only have you been called out, but you've been called to a purpose. You are unusual. You're different. And a lot of us struggle because we try to be like the world. But I've come to understand this, that you are a misfit. You ain't supposed to fit. You ain't supposed to be like everybody else. And Jesus is saying, if you want to experience me, you must take on an attitude that welcomes those that are not like you in the presence of me. Jesus' method is a practice. And he's saying that, look here, blessed are those who behave in a certain way is a practice. To love the unlovable and to forgive the unforgivable. And the question that I ask you, what is your practice? It was Ray Burberry that says, if you want to be good, you have to practice, practice, practice. If you don't love something, then don't do it. There's a story about a woman that was driving in the poor side of section of society, and there she seen a little boy walking in tattered clothes. And this little boy reminded her of her grandbaby and her grandson, and she just couldn't resist it, so she pulled over and she said, let me give you a ride. And the little boy looked in the car, and without hesitancy, he jumped in. And he sat in the passenger seat. And there in the passenger seat, she said, "Have you eaten yet?" And he said, "No, ma'am." And then she pulled up and she got him something to eat. And her spirit wasn't satisfied, and she said, I want to give you something. So she went to her back seat and she gave him some of her grandson's clothes. She said, "I want you to wear these." And the little boy started to cry, and he looked at her and he said, "Are you God?" And the woman paused and she said, "No, why do you ask?" He said, "You act like her. You must be God." And she said, "No, I'm just one of his children." The Beatitudes is a reflection of us being a part of God and the family. And my suggestion to you is, what are you practicing? Go with God. May God bless you. May God keep you.